Hi everyone. This is the review for Chapter 1 of Biology 111. I went through the chapter and am going to just review some of the more difficult concepts in there. This should be about a 15-minute long section that you can view at your leisure. So one of the first things I wanted to go over was the concept of emergent properties. Emergent properties, the wording in the book is difficult. Essentially, it's a small part that makes sense in a larger system. So the example that uh, that the book used was you have a box full of parts, but when you put all those parts together, it makes a bicycle. And the bicycle having a function of being able to ride it would be an emergent property that you can't see when you're just looking at an individual pedal. So applied to biology, if we look at um, the molecules in a plant cell, they don't necessarily make sense if they're just in a test tube, but when we see them all functioning together, there are these emergent properties, these things um, that we see happen when they're in that larger system. The study of emergent properties and how those different parts interact within a system is called systems biology. Um, a few other terms that were difficult in this chapter: genes, genome, genomics. So a gene is a section of DNA that codes for a certain protein or expression. So I have the gene that gives me blonde hair. The genome is all of the genes that a person has. So like the entire organism, their genomic information is called the genome. Um, Genomics is the study of a genome. Um, there's also the terms proteome and proteomics, which is hard to say. So a proteome is all the proteins that an organism's DNA is going to code for. And proteomics is the study of those proteins. An important distinction to make when we're moving into sort of this next section, getting past DNA and into organisms. A consumer is different from like a carnivore, okay? So you have producers like plants, which take energy from the sun and chemicals from the air and soil, and they produce sugars. And then you have a consumer, which could be a deer come by and eat the plant. And then a wolf comes and eats the deer. Both the deer and the wolf are consumers because they're getting those sugars through the plant ultimately. The deer is eating the plant, and then the wolf is eating the deer. So those carbon chains uh, are passed up the food chain. Um, the book also makes an important distinction between energy through flow in a system and chemical cycles. So chemicals tend to make a cycle through a system. Like um, think about water. Um, Water falls from the sky as rain and it goes into the soil. A plant's roots are going to soak that up and incorporate it into its cells. Um, Eventually, that water is going to evaporate through the leaves, or when the plant dies, it's going to dry out, and that water is going to either go back into the soil or go back into the air. So the water has just been cycled through the system, whereas energy is generally going through the system, more of a line rather than a circle. Sun energy from the sun is going to hit the plant. The plant's going to absorb that energy and use it to forge chemical bonds, and then that energy's getting passed through the food chain. But each animal or organism that brings that energy up, some of it's going to dissipate as heat or be lost to the environment. And that's just, that energy is lost, and we've got to go get more from the sun later. We can't really get that back from the environment. Jumping to a new concept, feedback regulation. This can be sort of difficult to understand. Essentially, there are some cascades of molecules that are the end product affects that chain. So the easiest way to understand this is negative feedback. Essentially, the product you're getting from this chain reaction is going to inhibit the chain. So I'm producing a chemical that is going to prevent me from producing too much of that chemical. Like I'm producing insulin, and when my body gets enough insulin, it's the insulin itself that is going to go shut down insulin production. And there's a good diagram in the book for that if you haven't looked at that already. Touching briefly on the domains of life, there's eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. Eukarya, those are eukaryotic organisms. I'm a eukaryotic organism. So is yeast. So is a dog and a tree. Anything that has the nuclear membrane is eukaryotic. So there's a review question at the end of this chapter that talks about are protists in the bacteria or eukarya domain. They're eukaryotes because they have a nuclear membrane, whereas bacteria and archaea do not. So getting to the Darwin stuff in evolution, Darwin's two main theories on the origin of species were the idea of descent with modification. Basically, I give my genetic information to my offspring, and the offspring have that, but it's changed a little bit. And then natural selection, it requires a variable heritable traits, so traits that can be passed down. It requires different organisms to have different traits. So like I have blonde hair, someone else has brown hair. That's a variation in the traits, and we pass those traits to our offspring. And then there's the idea that the amount of offspring that an organism can produce is more than the number of offspring that the ecosystem can support. So you've got a surplus of offspring, and so that's going to create competition for resources. And the individuals with the best adaptations to the environment are going to get those resources better, more quickly, more fully than the less well adapted individuals. And so the well adapted individuals are going to pass their good traits down the line to their offspring because they're going to get to reproduce, whereas the individuals that are not well adapted might die, not get to reproduce, and their traits are not passed down. This doesn't require the individual with bad genes to like die without reproducing, but over time we should see natural selection take place as good genes are favored by evolution over the bad genes. Moving on to scientific theory and constructing an experiment. There's two different kinds of reasoning used in scientific uh, exploits. Inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning are the two types. So uh, inductive reasoning is going from small to big. Basically, if I run an experiment to see if wood floats, and I take a piece of wood and I put it in the water, and I can say, okay, since this stick I put in the water floated, I can reason inductively that all sticks float. That's inductive reasoning. For it to really work well, you need a large sample size. So I would need to do that experiment with hundreds of sticks in order to say with confidence, yes, all sticks float. Um, Deductive reasoning is going from big to small. So I know that all sticks float, therefore, this stick that I go pick up off the ground should float, moving from big to small. As far as experimental design goes, you want to have a controlled experiment where you are holding all of the variables so they don't change except for the independent variable, which is one that you as the scientist will change. So I am seeing if plants need light to grow. I'm going to put one in the closet with the lights off, and I'm going to put the other one outside, and I'm going to compare the results. The independent variable in that experiment is light, because I'm denying light to one and giving light to the other. The dependent variable is what the plant does in response to the change in the independent variable. So the plant either flourishing or dying due to presence of light is the dependent variable because it's dependent on the other one. And in a really well-designed experiment, you only have one variable that you have to work with. Things get a lot murkier the more variables you have. There's also an important distinction in the book between science and technology. These are conflated a lot of times, but essentially, science is a tool that we use to understand things. Science has no end goal other than understanding the natural world. So as a biologist, I just want to know, like, how do cheetahs run so fast? Or like, why why do polar bears have white fur? How do they stay warm in the winter? It's just all curiosity led. Whereas technology is generally more application led, like okay, we want to design something to screen for cancer better. That's not science, that's an application, that's a technology. So an important distinction there. I hope this review has been helpful for you guys. Looking forward to seeing you next week.